Thank you, Sam. All right, moving on, we will have the next presentation, Review of City Debt by Tracy Turback, our Financial Director.
Good afternoon, councilors. Tracy Turback with the Finance Office here to thrill you with a presentation on city debt. I know that's not necessarily a real exciting topic, but it is an important one. In light of the fact that, as you folks know, you've got an important decision coming up here in the near future regarding financing for an office building project. It does seem to be timely to talk about city debt. It's been a couple of years since I came and just had kind of a general conversation with the council about the city debt, kind of a 101, if you will, on municipal financing, municipal debt. And so that's part of my presentation today is kind of a refresher course on that to refresh your memories on some of that stuff, as well as provide an update on where we are today and how we are managing our debt today. And then also, in large part, to arm you with the information that I think you'll need to make a well-informed decision next month when you are asked to consider financing for this upcoming project. The presentation today, this is kind of an overview. We'll talk about the types of tools that we have in our toolbox, very common among municipalities. We'll talk about what the appropriate uses are for debt, when it's used, when we don't use debt. I'll provide an update, a status report essentially on the current debt outstanding for the city, what we do and what others do in terms of monitoring that city debt. Discuss with you at some length the considerations that I think you should make before making a decision on issuing debt. Provide you some background and information on the manageable status, what I believe the city's debt currently is, and looking forward into the future. So jumping in then, in terms of the types of debt that are available, the general obligation or GO bonds is one form of bonds that the city is authorized to issue. It's really the strongest form of debt that any municipality could issue, or state for that matter. It pledges the full faith and credit of the city, and it would be repaid using special property tax levy. And because it involves an addition to the property tax levy, it does require a public vote, and in order to pass in South Dakota, a GO bond takes a 60% approval. So that's one tool in the toolbox in terms of financing projects. More commonly, revenue bonds are utilized for cities in South Dakota, and I think around the country that's probably fairly typical. Revenue bonds are repaid using a specific revenue stream, therefore they don't provide to an investor that full faith and credit pledge that a general obligation bond would have. Revenue bonds are authorized by ordinance, so it takes an action by the city council, but there is no public, because there's no property tax levy or that type of thing involved as there is with the GO bond, it doesn't require a public vote. The distinction that's made when we talk about revenue bonds, really because they, as the name indicates, they are distinguished by their source of repayment. So it has to do with the revenue stream that's backing that particular financing that will generate the revenue to make the principal and interest payments over the life of the bond. So there are a number of different revenue streams that the city has that potentially could be utilized to service a revenue bond. Sales taxes, of course, are very commonly used to back revenue bonds. Of course, in the case of the city of Sioux Falls, we have a first penny sales tax, a second penny sales tax, and an entertainment sales tax as well. So any one of those represent a possible revenue stream that could be utilized to back a revenue bond. It's quite common in our city and cities around the country for enterprise fund charges to be utilized to provide that security and that source of repayment for revenue bonds, whether it's for a water or sewer utility, electric, and landfill and parking. Those are the 5 enterprises that the city of Sioux Falls maintains. And of course, they have a dedicated revenue stream in each case, and that those revenue streams could potentially be utilized to secure and repay a revenue bond. In addition to those, storm drainage fees have in the past been utilized to secure revenue bonds, as have tax increment revenues. So those are some of the more commonly used revenue streams that would be used for a revenue bond. Some additional tools that municipalities have would include capital leases. So we can lease property or equipment utilizing a capital lease, and there are also provisions under state law for promissory notes or to purchase property on a contract for deed. So that's really in kind of a nutshell the tools that the city of Sioux Falls has, or any South Dakota municipality has, with regard to borrowing money or incurring debt. When is debt appropriate? I don't think it's any surprise. Certainly for large capital projects, that's pretty much exclusively where you will see debt utilized, especially in the case of the city of Sioux Falls, but around South Dakota, I think it would be unusual to find long-term debt financing used for anything other than large capital projects. And those projects are typically the type that will have long-term benefits, and there is a kind of a concept within financing of local government financing, and one of the things that we try to do and implement where possible is that those that benefit from improvements should bear the cost, or at least some portion, typically a significant portion of the cost. You might think of water reclamation projects, for example. We've invested a lot into our sanitary sewer system in recent years, utilizing borrowed money, revenue bonds, if you will, and over the period of time that those are paid back, the folks that are utilizing the system here in Sioux Falls are the ones that are generating the revenues and contributing the revenues to repay that. So there's a kind of an element of equity in that, in terms of utilizing debt financing for those types of projects. As you folks know, a lot of the capital investments, capital improvements that the city makes are financed using cash, or on what I refer to as a pay-as-you-go basis. We don't borrow money for all of our capital improvements, but there are times with large capital projects where just a pay-as-you-go approach just isn't very practical. The impact to other capital projects, dropping one single large project into the plan, could really turn our 5-year plan on its head and really force us to delay a lot of projects that are in the works. So that's when that happens. Debt financing is certainly an appropriate solution to that. So when does the city of Sioux Falls utilize debt? Pretty much the way I've been talking about with enterprise fund infrastructure and facilities. Any one of our 5 enterprise funds, again, we could utilize and have in the past utilized debt financing. Other municipal purposes, the city has used financing for other types of infrastructure, whether it's roads or bridges, drainage systems, certainly facilities like libraries, fire stations. The law enforcement center was financed with bonds. A number of other facilities, communities, the event center, convention center. Those are typically what we have utilized debt financing for here in Sioux Falls. Of course, we occasionally do issue debt as well to refinance previously issued debt if there's an advantage to capture lower interest costs. That's something that the city has done most recently. That was back in 2010. We refinanced some entertainment tax bonds that have since been retired. When don't we utilize debt? And this is, I think, just part of the good old-fashioned South Dakota prudence, that we don't borrow money to pay our day-to-day operating expenses. That's just it's bad financial management, and we don't borrow money to finance assets with short lives or relatively short lives. So That's something that is not all that uncommon. One of the things you'll see if a community is under some sort of fiscal distress or starting to feel some distress, utilizing capital leases for rolling stock or equipment is one of the first things they'll look at, because they can meet their need for that equipment and spread the cost out over time. But that is kind of a slippery slope, I guess, if you will, to utilize capital financing for assets like that have short lives, and it's something we certainly avoid here with the city of Sioux Falls. And if you read about communities around the country that are in severely distressed situations, they are borrowing money to pay their day-to-day operating expenses, and that's certainly a situation that we would never want to see the city of Sioux Falls approach. So that's those are kind of on the absolute blacklist in terms of financing. By way of an update, as of December 31st, 2015, we ended the year with $337.2 million in outstanding debt. Nearly all of that was in the form of revenue bonds. $336.7 million of that is in revenue bonds. As I mentioned, that's really the most common use of financing that the city does. Among the revenue bonds, it's split fairly close to 50-50 between second penny sales tax bonds and debt within our enterprise funds. So that's a fairly close split. About $180 million in second penny sales tax bonds were outstanding at the end of the year. A little more than that, $153 million in water and wastewater, and that amount is split fairly equally between the water and wastewater funds. And then there's another $3.4 million in storm drainage and TIF debt outstanding. We have one small promissory note. The state of South Dakota has loaned the city some money. That was something that occurred a number of years ago. There's an interest-free loan for $500,000, so that's the other piece that's not a true revenue bond. I think some of the important takeaways from this is that we have no outstanding general obligation bonds. The city has no GO bonds. We have no bonds outstanding that are secured or repaid with property tax revenues or first penny sales tax revenues. We no longer have any entertainment tax bonds outstanding. And three of our 5 enterprise funds have no debt as well. The parking system, the landfill, and the electric utility all are debt-free. So those are some key points here. And as I mentioned, we have no capital leases outstanding. So that's kind of a snapshot of where we ended 2015. Next thing I want to talk about is monitoring of debt. This is something that's important. It's one of the reasons I do come back periodically and talk to you folks about it. We do report out on our debt amounts. It's updated for you folks every month throughout the year in our monthly financial status report. Typically shows up on page 17. If you haven't taken a look at it, I'd encourage you next time you get one of those reports to flip to that page and take a look, and it will in detail out every outstanding bond issue that we have, every outstanding state loan that we have, and what the current status of that is. In addition to the monthly financial reports, of course, our annual comprehensive financial report covers our debt as well. It's all reported in our financial statements. In the footnotes to those financial statements, there are several pages of disclosures and information on all the outstanding debt that the city has. It gives a lot of in-depth information, the source of repayment, the status of repayment. All those sorts of things are disclosed in that financial report. Of course, that CAFR is subject to audit from an independent CPA firm each year. So there's additional monitoring that takes place as part of that audit process. And then the last thing I was going to mention is that periodically, every couple years or so, the internal audit team for the city of Sioux Falls will do a review of the city's financial condition. The most recent one was completed in 2014. And they don't look solely at debt, but the debt status is covered in here. They look at trends related to debt and debt service costs. compare the city of Sioux Falls with other cities in the region on a per capita basis. They also look at analysis of a number of financial ratios to make an assessment of both the short-term and long-term solvency of the city of Sioux Falls. And I think if you pull out that report, you may have read it a couple years ago, but it's worth refreshing your memory a little bit on just how solid our independent audit team feels the city of Sioux Falls is as well, and it's I think will provide some reassurance to you folks that we do very well in terms of overall benchmarks, and then comparing ourselves to peer communities, we compare very favorably as well. Moving on to some of the things that are important considerations before deciding on issuing debt really fall into three categories. At least the way I think of it, there are legal considerations. The state of South Dakota Constitution establishes legal debt limits for municipalities. That's certainly one of the first questions anybody should ask, I guess, in terms of issuing debt. If we're considering issuing more debt, is it within our legal debt limit? The constitutional debt limit is based on the assessed value of all property, so it's based on the values of real estate. There are a number of different limits in the Constitution. The limit we pay closest attention to is the 5% limit that really can be used for any purpose, and the debt that we issue counts against that 5% limit. 5% of the total assessed value in Sioux Falls would be $568 million, so we've got considerable room before we would ever even approach that legal debt limit. So from a practical standpoint, the legal debt limit for the city of Sioux Falls really doesn't come into play at all. We could issue another $230 million in debt and not hit our legal debt margin. So it is important in a lot of other communities in the state, smaller communities, maybe communities that aren't growing, certainly to the degree that we are. They do have challenges in accomplishing some of the projects they need to in bumping up against that legal debt limit, which presents some, they need to get a little more creative. Certainly from your perspective, public acceptance as elected officials is a concern. You folks hear from the public on all sorts of issues. Certainly if you're considering issuing debt for a project, that's something that you folks have a finger on the pulse of. And lastly, and what I'll spend most of the rest of the presentation, or much of the rest of my presentation, talking about are the financial considerations. And it really boils down to maintaining good debt management, that keeping it affordable and maintaining our flexibility going forward. The affordability and flexibility aspects really go to, as I say, keeping debt manageable. We look at a lot of different aspects of that: historical revenue growth, our ability to grow revenues, other demands on revenue streams that we might be considering utilizing debt for, the rate at which we're retiring our currently outstanding debt, how quickly are we paying that debt off, coverage ratios, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means and why that's important. The bond ratings is certainly an indicator of whether or not we're maintaining debt at an affordable level. It's kind of an objective viewpoint. And then interest rate environment, certainly where interest rates are go to the affordability issue. So measuring the affordability of a debt issuance and maintaining financial flexibility going forward are really important considerations in keeping debt manageable. The next few slides, I want to take a look at some of the key things that we look at to gauge the affordability of debt when we're considering that, and the flexibility we retain when debt is issued. So with that in mind, the financial considerations are all about keeping debt manageable. So what do I mean by that? What does it mean to be maintain our debt at a manageable level? We measure that in a number of different ways. First one I'll point out, debt service as a percent of our annual budget. And that's also one of the things that internal audit looks at when they do their review of the city's financial condition. We look at the rate of repayment. Again, how fast are we paying those bonds off? How fast are we recapturing that ability to borrow money in the future should a need arise? We do compare ourselves with other cities, as does the internal audit team. On a per capita basis, we look at whether or not the revenue stream that we're considering for a repayment source on bonds, just how strong that is. Has it been growing? Is it flat? Those are things that we consider. And then, of course, the independent evaluation of the bond rating. I've got slides on a number of these, but the one I don't have a slide on, but I do want to point out the debt service as a percent of the annual budget. In 2016, our total principal and interest payments amount to 8.4% of our total budget. So that includes all of our debt payments, whether it's repaid from second penny sales tax, from water revenue, sewer revenues, wherever that principal and interest payment is coming from, 8.4%. So about 8.5 cents out of every dollar is going to repay principal and interest. The internal audit in their review suggests that a benchmark should be no more than 15%. So we're well below. We compare very favorably to the suggested benchmark that would put us in up against the limit. So we're in good shape in terms of the percent of our annual budget that's going to debt service. And if you think about that in terms of a business or even a personal household budget, might give you some additional perspective as well. The rate of repayment on current debt, and this is something that's really geared toward financial flexibility going forward. We never know with absolute certainty what the future holds. We don't know when the next need might arise where we need to borrow money. So from a finance director standpoint, we always try to structure the debt so we can afford the payments, but also not stretch it out so far that we don't pay it off quickly enough that we recapture that ability, that financial flexibility. The report, the most recent monthly report, we pointed out that the principal repayments in 2015, our debt went down by more than $24 million. So that's a net number. So there was some additional draws on some of our state revolving fund loans, but after we consider those additional draws and all the principal payments, our overall amount of debt outstanding decreased by over $24 million. And you can see on the slide, in the next 5 years, we will pay off $121 million of that current amount of debt outstanding. So out of that $337 million, over a third of it will be paid off in the next 5 years. And then in looking a little further down the road, in the next 10 years, over 3/4 of it, 77% of the debt that's currently outstanding will be paid off. So one of the things that tells me and that I hope you pick up on and relate to is that we are recapturing that very, very quickly, our ability to borrow money. We're not stretching terms out. We try to keep them as short as we can. A lot of our enterprise debt is borrowed on a 10-year basis, so it's borrowed and paid off within 10 years. So that's really a key factor in maintaining our long-term outlook, particularly because we are a growing community. We know that there are going to be needs in the future, and it's important to pay that debt off at a good clip. It's really a very key measure of financial flexibility. Looking at a kind of comparisons to other communities on a per capita basis, and these are numbers that were updated by PFM, our financial advisor, last fall in November. The cities are a lot of the same cities that internal audit uses in their comparisons as well when looking at the financial ratios. And you can see that Sioux Falls compares very favorably, $2,258 of per capita debt. Puts us really in a very good position relative to some of these other communities. You look at Fargo and Lincoln, and they're at more than double what we are on a per capita basis. So that certainly is while it's not something that would necessarily drive a decision, it does from a public official standpoint give you some perspective on on what our financial condition is and whether or not we are, quote unquote, have too much debt. Looking now a little more specifically at our second penny sales tax revenues, as I mentioned, strong revenue growth is another very important element in keeping our debt manageable. The upcoming discussion that you'll have about issuing debt will focus on the second penny sales tax revenues. That is what will be proposed relative to the office building. This graphic shows you a 25-year historical perspective starting in 1990 and going through 2015, just our most recently completed fiscal year. And you can see what the growth has been. We've gone from about 13.6 million in 1990 in revenue from our second penny sales tax to over $58 million in 2015. So that's a significant, and as you can see in the graphic, a very steady rate of growth that averages out to an annual increase of 6% per year for a 25-year period of time. So that's the kind of thing that just makes bond rating agencies giddy. Bond investors love to see that kind of lockstep, steady and strong growth in a revenue stream before they loan us the money. There's 1 year on the graphic where revenues did decrease. If you look in 1991, revenues actually did decrease slightly. And there would have been another decrease in 2009, but that also happened to be the year that the penny got rounded up from 0.92 to a full percentage point. So we did see a decrease in 2009 in our first penny revenues, but because of the rate increase on our second penny, it doesn't reflect that on the graphic. So, but again, very, very solid track record in terms of growing our second penny sales tax revenues. Strong coverage ratios are also critical in maintaining manageable debt service costs, and when considering issuing debt, it's important to be conservative in projecting future revenues. So the previous slide looked back 25 years. This slide would be a 25-year forward-looking picture of our second penny sales tax revenues. So we took the actual revenues in 2015 and plotted them out for the next 25 years at a 3% growth rate. Very, very conservative. 3% growth assumed going forward. As I said, the actual experience that we've had is 6% growth over that 25-year period of time, 6% annually. So you can see in 2016, if we grow at 3%, we'll generate about $60 million in second penny sales tax revenue. We're actually budgeting more than that because we budgeted about a 6% increase. But by 2040, 25 years later, you can see that second penny sales tax revenue will have grown to $120 million. And again, that's at 3% growth. So we haven't seen that low a growth in the past. But when we're considering issuing debt, we do want to be quite conservative, and it gives you a perspective on stress testing. What happens if it really does happen, if we only see 3% growth versus the 6% that we have seen? What kind of decisions will that lead to? What kind of a situation will that put the city in? This is really critical information in terms of trying to determine what our debt service coverage ratios are. And when we talk about revenue bonds, which second penny bonds are revenue bonds, investors and bond rating agencies like to look at the coverage ratio. And what that means is that they look at the amount of annual payments you're going to have to make as a city. And for every dollar of payment, they want to see at least $1.50 of revenue. So if in this case, our second penny sales tax revenues, they want to see $1.50 revenue for every dollar of debt service costs that we have that we're pledging this revenue for. So that's a fairly typical, fairly conservative approach. Bond investors are known to be very conservative investors. But the city council really, some years ago, took it to another level and said, we don't want to put ourselves at 1.5% or 1.5 times our debt service costs. The council actually established a policy of 2 times coverage. So in other words, for every dollar of second penny revenue that we're going to dedicate to debt service, we want another dollar on top of that. So we're going to have twice as much revenue coming in as what we've got dedicated to repay bonds. So that's over and above what bond investors or bond rating agencies might look at as conservative. The city has taken an even more conservative approach. In our 2016 budget, our budgeted coverage ratio was actually about $3.40 for every dollar of debt service that we're spending out of our second penny fund. We've got $3.43 of revenue. So again, very, very solid coverage ratio within our second penny sales tax bonds. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got about $180 million of outstanding bonds that we're paying on utilizing second penny revenues. So I wanted to demonstrate to you, based on this projection at 3% growth, what does it look like in terms of our currently outstanding bonds? What are our current payments going forward relative to that growth? So this graphic shows you the same blue bars and that same growth in our second penny revenues, going from 60 million in 2016 up to 120 million 25 years later in the year 2040. So it's the same revenue chart, but the principal and interest payments that we're currently obligated to pay, that we're currently paying out of our second penny revenues, is overlaid in red. So that tells you how much of our ongoing second penny revenues are going to be dedicated to debt service costs. Put that into perspective, in 2016, total principal and interest payments that will be made from our second penny sales tax revenues is about 18 million, or about 29%. So we're a long ways short of that 50% maximum policy that the City Council established some years ago. As you can also see in this graphic, in the year 2033, that's 18 years away. That sounds like a long time into the future, but 18 years goes by pretty quickly. You can see that's when the last of our currently outstanding bonds would be paid off. Now, if we see the kind of growth in the next 25 years that we saw in the past 25 years, of course, the blue bars grow at a much faster pace, at 6% versus 3%. So again, this is kind of a stress test, if you will, to show that even at a 3% growth rate, we're staying well below the amount that the council has established as their policy. Now, the project team for the office building project will come back to you later this month. What I will do at that time then is to overlay what the projected debt service costs will be on that project. So you'll be able to see what we currently are obligated to as you are here, and then how much more would we add to that if we borrow money for that project. So you'll be able to see exactly the impact that that project will have going forward for our second penny. The next element of manageable debt is really, and it's really an indicator, I guess, if you will. If you don't believe a word I've said, you can look at the bond rating agencies' reports and how they view the city's financial ability to repay our debts. This reflects the view of Moody's Investors Rating Service. It's an objective, certainly an unbiased view from a respected outside rating agency. You can see about the third line from the top on that graphic, and I know it's difficult to read some of the smaller print there, but AA2 is very high grade, high quality bonds, and that's what the city's sales tax bonds are currently rated. So the bonds we have outstanding are rated at a AA2. On this entire scale, there are 22 possible ratings that Moody's can assign. 19 possible rating levels. 19 of those 22 are below AA2, with the worst at the very bottom being in default, if an issuer is in default. and then all the way up to a AA1. So those 19 are rated lower than what our sales tax bonds are. Only 2 possible ratings are higher. It's important, I think, a distinction too to point out, this is on sales tax bonds. This, if we were to issue general obligation bonds, not suggesting that we should even consider that, but if we did, typically they would be rated at least 1 notch higher than our sales tax bonds, because that would carry the full faith and credit pledge of the city. So that AA2 rating does speak loudly, I think, and clearly to bond investors that the city does a good job in managing its debt, and that we are very capable of repaying our debts. The final piece I want to talk about today in terms of gauging the manageability of city debt, or the affordability of interest rates. This graphic provides a 24-year history of municipal bond rates. The lines are a little messy. They're actually 3. This is something that PFM provided to us. It actually includes rates for 20-year and 30-year AAA, and then 20-year BB bonds. But you can kind of see that the real point of the slide is to show you that if you've heard a lot in the news about interest rates going up, and if you feel any sense at all of being anxious about interest rates, I would hope that this graphic would put you more at ease. Still very, very low historical rates today on municipal bonds. You can see that certainly down in that 3 to 5% range currently for municipal bonds. So very, very favorable time to be a borrower relative to interest rates. Just a few words about some of the upcoming projects. I've mentioned a couple times the administrative office building. We also have some other projects in the works that will likely involve borrowing. We continue to invest in our sanitary sewer system. You folks know that we've got some SRF loans in the process, and our 5-year plan includes some more investments into our sanitary sewer system, some relatively small storm drainage projects that would involve repayment from that revenue source. And then, of course, there's the parking facility that will be moving ahead, progressing later this year. So, to summarize, the city does use debt financing very prudently. Most of our capital needs, as you folks know, are met on a pay-as-you-go basis. Our 5-year plan reflects 83% of the capital investments that we'll make over the next 5 years will be paid for with cash. So we're using debt very, very sparingly in relation to the overall investments that we're making in our infrastructure. The debt is only used for those very large projects where assets clearly are going to outlive the debt by many, many years. The debt will long be paid off on any of these assets before the asset is taken out of use. I reviewed the variety of options that we have to choose. Certainly the debt that you see in the monthly reports, we report out on that regularly. It's monitored carefully. We've got some very, very conservative policies in place in terms of our debt service coverage on our second penny bonds, and by and large the manageability of the city's debt level is very, very strong in terms of per capita comparisons, coverage ratios, our strong revenue growth, wonderful bond ratings that we have, the rate at which we're paying off our existing bonds. Again, all points to debt for the city that is being very well managed. With that, I would entertain any questions.
Councilor Jameson?
Thank you, Tracy. This is a very, very thorough and very good job. I appreciate it. Even as a guy who's been around for a while, there's just so much to learn on this issue. Over the years, there's a lot of people who've contacted us and made specifically and argued that we have too much debt. We're wrecking the future all kinds of comments about debt. And debt seems to have a personal flavor for a lot of people who don't want any debt. And I think personally we should all strive for that. But for a growing community like we have, it's inevitable, and it's a leverage. It's a tool that we need to use. And I agree. I think we're doing it right. And even the way we did the pool, that was just right. I mean, even though I didn't like some things still it was the right way to spend money. I applaud you for doing that and your efforts and thoughts. And you and I don't always jive on some things, but thank you for doing this report. But I have a couple questions directly on the definition of a short-term asset.
Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned that we had used them for bridges and roads. I only know of one bridge, but are there roads that we've actually borrowed money for? I just can't remember. Do you know?
I don't recall any off the top of my head. Yeah, the 41st Street Bridge, I guess, was the one that came to mind as I put this information together.
I was a part of voting for that, and that's the only one I remember. But the reason I bring it up is that the challenge I keep hearing is that we have, like 41st Street and Minnesota Avenue, Louise Avenue, other roads in our community that we can't afford to pay for the replacement of out of our regular capital program. It would just decimate the whole program if we directed all of it to pay for one item. I'm just wondering if you've considered and thought about the idea of borrowing money in order to fund a road like Minnesota Avenue or 41st. Has that ever been thought through and processed?
We have had discussions with Public Works about that possibility. I can't say that it went into any sort of in-depth analysis of it. We never progressed to that point, but certainly there, and that's, it kind of ties into the whole discussion on the additional penny for infrastructure legislation that's been discussed for the last 5 years or so, and is going to be heard later this week in Pierre. So I mean, that's another possibility where some of those large infrastructure, whether it's a road, a bridge, drainage system, the flood control system, I mean, there are just a lot of needs out there for a growing community like ours. I think it's important to be very cautious about borrowing for projects that really, in essence, are kind of recurring in nature, so that we don't get caught in that trap where if we're borrowing money to fund what typically would be in our normal 5-year plan, that can be a little bit of a trap. So I think we want to be very, very cautious about, and again, I guess I would refer to them as more recurring in nature. It's the same kind of project. We're going to continue to have to build roads every year. If that's the expectation, it can present challenges as that borrowing kind of accumulates year after year. I think certainly for those kind of recurring projects, pay-as-you-go is definitely the preferred way, but there will be, no doubt, projects in the future that simply don't fit that model, and we'll have to look at other alternatives.
Right on. I was just checking to see if you'd kind of balance that out, because I've seen that as a challenge for us going forward. One other last question, I'll leave you alone. The debt service as a percent of the annual budget at 8.4%. I don't know what the history of that has been over the years, but that'd be an interesting number to see. And like the council has the 25% reserve for our operating budget, could you sense a place here as well for a number to be determined as a guiding number for us to follow, so we don't ever fall into a trap of, you argue that we should borrow a few $1 million here, a few $1 million there, and you maybe not look at some of these numbers like that, and you don't hold yourself in check. I'd be interested in the history of that percentage, and then as well, if you have an idea of what you would recommend as maybe a guiding principle to not go over, and maybe that's something that we could institute as a council policy.
Yeah, no, I can certainly follow up on that. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I think that is something that in the review that Internal Audit did, I do think they included some history in their report just as to how that's changed over the years. But again, the benchmark that they cited, the suggested benchmark was to keep it below 15%. So that's, you know, I guess you have to take that with a grain of salt in terms of, I don't know what the source of that is, if that's kind of a national guideline, perhaps that's been put out by different organizations, but I would think 15% would be quite high.
Councilor Staggers.
Yes, I have a couple questions. First of all, how much do we pay annually in purely interest?
I guess I'd have to follow up with that.
Okay. And then a second question is, we have future bonds for water rec projects, storm drainage, parking facility, administrative office building. At this time, do we know approximately how much we're going to be borrowing for all those 4 projects?
For some of them, we do. I think the wastewater projects over the next 5 years amount to somewhere around $80 million. The others, the office building will be back, the project team will be back later this month to report to you the results of the schematic design process and what the results of that are. So that's, you know, in a couple of weeks we'll have more information for you on that project. The storm drainage, I want to say that was between $4 and $5 million, I think, over the next 5 years. And again, the parking facility, that one also is kind of in a preliminary, very early stages of development, so we don't really have a good cost estimate for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Councilor Rolfing.
Yes, Tracy, thank you. 2 questions, if I may. One is general obligation GO bonds. You mentioned that we would go up a rung on the Moody's scale if we used GO bonds. How much interest would we save? Is it, in other words, is it worth doing? Save the interest rather than just not have general obligation bonds? Because we're going to pay them off regardless of what they are.
Right, we would certainly pay them off, yeah. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that in terms of what the spread might be between a AA2 and a AA1 if we went up 1 notch. We could certainly ask our financial advisor to provide some input into that. Keep in mind that in order to get that GO authorization, it's put up to a vote and it requires 60% approval, and that can be a very high hurdle.
Right.
Particularly if there's a property tax source for repayment that's tied to that. That can be a high hill for any community to climb.
Understand, just want to know. And then the TIF revenues type of debt. I was under the impression we had no TIFs that we were internally financing, that they were all financed by the person, the developer, or whoever it was that asked for the TIF. I must be wrong. I heard that the other day.
I don't recall I don't know the number of the TIF. It's the Sharapa Place tax increment district where the city did sell bonds that are being repaid from the revenues from that tax increment district.
Okay, so that's the only one, because generally that's not our.
Right, that's unique in that respect. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Erickson.
Thank you. I found myself writing notes, and you answered lots of my questions as we continued on, so I'll keep it very brief. My one question is on page 6, where it says the rate of repayment on current debt. We have, like you said on the back page, some substantial amount of projects that we're going to be considering, from the parking facility, which is close to that $10 million, storm drainage, water reclamation, and then the administrative office building, which I won't pretend to know a number of any sort. I know nobody likes to hear a number thrown in there, but those are substantial projects. So my question is as we take those out, I would be curious what that does for the next 5 years and the next 10 years as we add that on, and how the percentages change. I know we're talking about paying off that amount of current debt, but when we add to it too, that would be something I'd be interested in seeing in the future. So thank you. This was very thorough, and appreciate your effort in putting this together for us.
You're welcome.
Okay. Any other questions, comments from the council? Seeing none, thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
With that, this meeting is now adjourned.